The last train sighed into the dark like a tired animal, steam feathering the night while snow came down in patient, endless flakes. The station roof caught the fall and let it whisper through broken slats, so the platform kept its own soft weather, a drifting hush that made bootsteps sound like secrets. A lantern burned in the telegraph window, thin and yellow, its glass fogged by a clerk's breath. On the bench beneath it sat a carpetbag patched in places where the world had been unkind. Beside the bag stood its owner, a woman in a sun-worn dress that once held a hopeful color and now kept only memory. She fixed her gloves the way people fix their faces, careful, steady, almost brave. Wind pinched her cheeks and found the loose thread at her cuff, tugging like an impatient child. Somewhere down the line a coyote called, and the rails answered with a cold ring. It was evening by the clock, but night by the feeling, the kind of night that makes you weigh what you carry. She had letters folded flat in her pocket, inked with a stranger's tenderness, promises shaped like rooms, like bread, like warmth. None of them could melt snow. The station master stepped out and tucked his scarf higher, eyes doing that careful arithmetic men do around trouble they can't fix. "No more trains tonight," he said, like telling the weather what it already knew. "Morning if the line holds." She thanked him and did not move. Her breath rose like little ghosts and then were gone. Across the tracks a dog nosed through drifted paper and found nothing worth the finding. She thought of the man whose name filled her letters, the tidy hand, the way he wrote the word home as if it could be bottled. He had said he would meet the evening train, hat in hand, buggy ready, stew warming on a stove. She looked up each time a lantern swayed, and each time the lantern belonged to nobody she recognized. The clerk inside clicked a few more words into the dark and turned down his flame. The platform grew wider, the world narrower. She sat, not to rest, but to keep from falling. The bench was cold through her dress, cold through hope. She unpinned a curl that had clung damp to her temple and repinned it with hands that would not stop their small trembling. Snow collected on the carpetbag in a neat white square. She brushed it off and then, because the motion felt like purpose, brushed the bench as well, as if clearing a place for someone who would surely come. That was when the little one appeared, no heavier than a bundle of quilts, cheeks berry bright, hair escaping a ribbon that had lost its fight. The child's coat hung open above a too-thin dress, and one bootlace dragged a wet, dirty tail. She marched with the fearless seriousness of 4 years and stood at the woman's knee, studying her with a solemnity grown people borrow when they marry their hearts to hope. The woman crouched, the sudden move turning her vision to stars. "You out here alone?" she asked, and the question tasted strange in the winter air, because alone was the word that had been riding her all day. The child didn't answer. She lifted the woman's hand, turned it palm up like a page, and blew warm breath on the blue veins there. Then she said, with the kind of mercy that sounds like truth, "Your hands are shaking." The woman slid off one mitten and fitted over the child's bare fingers. It swallowed them whole. Snow made lace on the little wrist. The mitten made a promise the woman wasn't sure she had a right to give. "Where's your mama?" she asked, but softly now, the way you speak to a candle. The child's eyes shifted to the far end of the platform, where a figure stood half inside the dark, a tall man in a work coat, hat brim salted with snow, posture steady as a fence post. He did not come crowding near. He watched with the patience of someone who has learned how easily frightened things run. When he met the woman's gaze, he tipped his hat, the gesture plain as bread. No introduction, no claim. The station master, passing, nodded toward him. "Ranch land out past the creek," he murmured, as if describing weather. "Good man, keeps to himself." The woman felt something unclench, then clench again. A good man is sometimes the hardest kind to believe in. The child wiggled her mittened hand, proud of its new warmth, and reached for the woman's other hand as if measuring whether two might fit where one had been. Wind drew a white curtain across the tracks, and the world beyond it dissolved into guesswork. Shadows climbed the platform posts like vines, and the snow kept writing its slow letter to whoever would read it. The woman stood to leave and found there was nowhere to go that did not feel like a mistake. The boarding house lamps had winked out. The street was a ribbon with no music. She lifted her carpetbag, and the weight of it argued with her spine. The man at the far end took one step, then stopped, as if believing that too much kindness can spook a soul the way thunder spooks cattle. He pointed, gently, toward town, toward a porch light. She could sleep there, maybe. The child, still close, leaned into the woman's skirt, the small warmth of her a kind of frontier fire. Her ribbon had slipped entirely. Her hair clung with snow. She looked up, lips trembling with determination rather than fear, and gave the sort of verdict that leaves no appeal. "You look lonely," she said, the words careful as stitches, "and I'm tired of crying alone." The man's breath plumed. The woman's hand did not let go. Beneath the falling, stubborn snow, wind shouldered the platform as if to carry it off, blowing the lamp flame flat and sending snow in bright, slanting threads across the tracks. The man stepped forward a pace, nothing hurried in him, and said he could see her to the boarding-house porch. His voice had the quiet weight of creek stones, steady and plain, and his breath unscrolled in pale ropes that vanished as soon as they formed. The child tugged his coat hem and shook her mittened hand, a small bell of wool. "Home," she said, and then softer, "Please." The woman's carpet-bag cut into her fingers. Pride, that old iron in the blood, warned her against accepting what she could not repay. But the boarding-house was black as a shut-eye, and the lock on the store beyond it would not care that the night had teeth. She looked from the man's face to the child's, from the patience in one to the brave need in the other, and nodded once. A decision no louder than a breath changed the color of the cold. They walked through town with the snow rearranging the streets into new shapes. Sills wore white brows. A dog trotted ahead, rewriting their path with a happy tail. The woman's boots sank past their stitching, and the damp found her stockings, but the child's hand pulsed a little stove's heat against her palm. The man did not speak unless there was a rut to warn of, a patch of ice to steer around. His hat brim caught the moon's weak milk. Somewhere a late stove coughed. At the last fence before open land the wind rose, wide and mournful. The man opened the gate, then held out his hand not for the woman but for her bag. She shook her head. He didn't insist. The gesture, refused and accepted at once, spared them both from something sharp. The child hopped from one footprint to the next, pretending they were boats and the dark water between them would swallow her if she missed. When she slipped, the woman caught her by the back of the dress and kept her laughing. The cabin shouldered up from the drifting dark like a friend who had been there all along. Smoke stitched a gray thread from the chimney to the low clouds. A pane near the door held a small square of lamplight, the color of saved honey. Inside smelled of split pine, damp while drying by the hearth, and the faint mercy of stew. The man set a log, coaxed the flame, and the room went from wolf-cold to human in the time it takes to blink. Hooks by the door held a child's coat and a second that had belonged to a woman with narrower shoulders. The woman stood just inside the threshold, not ready to put down what she had carried far. The child tugged again, and this time it was toward a chair near the fire, a cushion hollowed by use. The man gestured, and when she did not move, he fetched another chair and placed it a respectful distance away, as if to say, "Sit or don't, you are not trapped by kindness here." His hands were nicked and healed in different weather. His gestures were weathered too. On the table waited one tin bowl, one spoon, one folded square of cloth. He laid two more settings without commentary, the way a man mends a fence that needs mending. She watched his economy. How he turned the ladle, how he wiped the stove ledge with the back of his wrist, how nothing clattered. The child climbed into the woman's lap, uninvited, unafraid, and produced a carved horse from somewhere in her dress. Its legs were uneven, its mane a row of hopeful cuts, and one ear had survived some ungentle pocket. "Did you make that?" the woman asked, and the child nodded until the ribbon in her hair gave up again. The man's mouth made a ghost of a smile that did not reach to his eyes, not because it couldn't but because those eyes were watching other weather. The woman fed the child a spoon of stew, then tasted her own. It was humble. Beans, potato, something that remembered beef. But in the right mouth it could be called good, and this was the right mouth. Steam softened the tight places behind her ribs. The carpet-bag on the floor leaned into its shadow like a tired animal. She could feel the letters through the fabric, their folded corners printing faint shapes on the lining. He did not ask about them. He asked, after a while, whether her shoes would dry by the hearth without shrinking. When she glanced down, he had already set a small square of oilcloth beneath them, as if against the moment they wept. The child lifted the carved horse and cantered it along the woman's arm. "He doesn't throw," she said, working hard to keep her eyelids from closing. Not even when he's scared. The woman understood the sermon beneath the play and let the wooden muzzle rest in her palm. She could feel a burr the knife had left along the jaw. "My mama," the child went on, with the ceremonious gravity of a bedtime truth. She liked the wind chime. It sounded like laughing when nobody was. The woman looked toward the window and saw it, a string of thin spoons and bottle glass chips, clicking softly where draft found them. The sound, small as it was, filled corners even the fire could not reach. She closed her eyes a moment and put the chime inside the same box in her chest where the better parts of old Sundays lived. After the bowls were rinsed and set to dry, the man pulled the quilt from the rocker and shook it out. The pattern had been pieced from dresses, a line of faded blue calico, a stubborn red, a check that had outlasted 100 washings. He laid it across the bed near the hearth and stepped back as if arranging a stage. The woman touched its edge and something in her hands forgot how to pretend. She unpinned her hair and shook the travel from it. He looked away as if the act were a prayer. When the child's head finally tumbled to the pillow, she caught the woman's sleeve and held it there. "Stay," she whispered, already sailing. The woman sat until the breath beneath her hand evened and the horse tilted from the small fist and clattered once to the floor. The man gathered it and set it on the table beside a tin cup, as if to mark the place where a new story might begin. His eyes found the letter's outline in the carpetbag and returned to the fire. Whatever he knew about being chosen last, he did not make her pay for it. He banked the flames and spoke low, practical words about the morning. If the snow kept, the road would go to glass. If it lifted, he would bring the wagon and see her safely to the boarding house. She nodded, though the nod hurt. The room held its breath between two futures. She tucked the quilt to the child's chin, then tucked something inside herself the way a woman tucks a note into a Bible, so it will keep its meaning. Night laid its weight across the roof. Beyond the window, the world had become a blank page, patient and wide. The wind chime clicked like distant cups on a wooden table. The woman reached into her pocket and touched the topmost letter, feeling the shape of the word home pressed there by another hand. When she drew it out into the lamplight, the seal cracked like thin ice. The child stirred, then settled. The man's shadow held its shape on the wall. She began to read, and the first line, sharp as January, said he would not be coming, not now, not ever. Morning broke pale and brittle. Sunlight stretched thin over a world that still wore last night's storm. Frost webbed the cabin windows, and the girl's breath puffed in little clouds as she helped button her coat. The woman kept her eyes on the task, fingers steady even as the letter from the night before lay folded deep in her skirt pocket, heavier than the carpetbag by the door. The man, already lacing his boots, said nothing about it. His silences were not empty. They carried the weight of a man who had learned that questions could sometimes wound more than cold. They set out for town, the snow crunching underfoot, the air sharp enough to carve edges into breath. The girl walked between them, mittened hand in each of theirs, skipping whenever the ground dipped. The woman could feel the man's presence even when their arms didn't brush, solid, unhurried, neither leading nor following. Still, she was aware of the distance they would cross once the town came into view, and with it, the eyes. Main Street was awake but quiet. A wagon creaked past, wheels groaning under the cold, its driver glancing once, twice. The mercantile's porch boards squealed under their boots, and behind the counter, a clerk paused mid-measure of sugar to study the stranger in the sun-faded dress and the child glued to her side. The look wasn't cruel, but it lingered too long, as if weighing her worth in some unspoken currency. Outside, two women from the seamstress's shop slowed their talk when she passed. Their eyes dipped to her hem, to the worn travel shawl, to the man walking close enough to suggest a tie but not close enough to prove one. She could almost hear the ledger they were writing in their minds, debts and faults, paid and unpaid. The girl tugged her hand, asking for the bakery, and she was grateful for the excuse to leave their gaze behind. Inside the bakery, warmth hit like an embrace. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and cinnamon, and a tray of loaves steamed on the counter. She asked the price of one small loaf, fingers closing around the single coin she had left. The baker's wife, round-faced and flushed, eyed her clothes and then offered the day-old ends for nothing. "They're just going to the pigs," she said, smiling without softness. The woman's spine straightened. "Thank you," she replied, but her hand stayed in her pocket. "Fresh, please." The man, without a word, laid the coins for the fresh loaf before the baker could argue. He passed it to the girl, who promptly split it down the middle, giving half to the woman as if it had been the plan all along. She took it because refusing would have meant refusing the child's small, warm triumph. They stopped at the post office next, the smell of ink and wood polish meeting them at the door. Behind the counter, the postmaster, a man with spectacles perched low on his nose, shuffled through letters until he found one with her name. The handwriting was familiar, the seal the same as those folded in her bag. Her fingers hesitated, then closed around it. She felt the man's gaze on her but didn't meet it. Not here. Not with the postmaster's polite curiosity and the girl's small hand still anchoring her. Out in the street, she slipped the letter into her coat. The weight of it felt different now, less like hope, more like something that could undo the fragile warmth she'd been gathering since the night before. She wondered if she would open it at all. The man adjusted the bread under his arm, the smallest crease appearing between his brows, as though he knew she carried news she hadn't asked for. By midday, the sky had softened into a pale blue, and the street filled with the muffled sounds of commerce, wooden doors opening and closing, harness bells shaking off their frost. At the edge of the square, a group of men loitered near the blacksmith's, their talk breaking into laughter as the trio passed. It wasn't what they said, just the way their eyes followed her, sliding from her face to the man's, to the child skipping in her oversized mitten. She could feel the story they were writing between them, a story she'd never agreed to be part of. The man didn't break stride, but his hand shifted subtly, drawing the girl a little closer to his side. That simple movement loosened something tight in the woman's chest. Not a defense made loud, not a claim shouted into the street, just presence, steady and unshaken. She met the men's eyes for half a breath before turning away, a decision settling in her bones like the slow warmth of tea. They ended their errands with a stop at the feed store, the smell of grain and burlap wrapping around them. The girl darted to a barrel of apples, choosing the smallest, reddest one and holding it out to the woman. "For you," she said, solemn as a preacher. The woman took it, felt the smoothness under her thumb, and slipped it into her coat pocket beside the unopened letter. Sweetness and dread, side by side. The walk back was quieter. The sun leaned low, catching in the man's hair where snow had melted to dark streaks. The girl began to hum, a tuneless, happy sound that made the woman's throat ache. The road curved, and the town fell out of sight, leaving only the sound of boots and the wind combing through the cottonwoods. She realized she was holding the bread in both hands, not guarding it from the cold but from the possibility of letting it go. At the cabin, the man opened the door and stood aside, letting her and the child enter first. The room was as they'd left it, quilt folded, fire banked, wind chime tapping its small, patient song. She set the bread on the table and loosened her shawl, feeling the heat from the hearth crawl up her arms. The girl went to the carved horse, trotting it in small circles on the floorboards, while the man knelt to stir the embers back to life. The woman touched the letter through her coat, her heart slowing and quickening at once. She thought of the eyes in town, some curious, some weighing, some kind enough to look away, and felt their residue still clinging to her like a thin dust. She was not yet sure if she would brush it off or let it settle. The man glanced up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers just long enough to hold a question without asking it. Then he nodded toward the table, where the girl was now setting the carved horse beside a second, unfinished piece, one ear yet to be shaped. The sight made her breath catch. She had the sudden, unsteady sense that someone had left a place for her, and that it was not empty by accident. By late afternoon the wind had gathered its teeth. Clouds thickened until the light was the color of pewter, and the cottonwoods leaned as if they meant to follow the storm wherever it was going. He had been watching the sky all day, glancing toward the horizon in the way a man does when he knows trouble is already on its feet. When the first flakes began to blow sideways, he stepped onto the porch and called her name. No urgency in it, just a quiet truth that could not be argued with. She came from where she'd been sweeping the cabin's floor, the girl trailing behind with a carved horse clutched like a talisman. He asked if she'd help him bring in the wood before the drifts swallowed the pile. The question was really an invitation, a small rope thrown across the space between them. She pulled her shawl tight and stepped into the raw air. The wind slapped color into her cheeks, and she bent against it, following his stride toward the stack. They worked without speaking much. He passed down split logs, and she carried them inside, each trip leaving snow to melt in dark petals on the floor. The girl sat on the hearth, turning the horse over in her mittened hands, humming a tune with no beginning. On the last armload, their hands brushed over the same piece of wood. Neither pulled away quickly. The cold in their skin was the same kind. By nightfall the wind had risen to a howl. Snow hurled itself against the windows and hissed through the gaps in the doorframe. He set a pot of stew over the fire, its steam curling up like a ghost trying to remember the shape of a body. She sat at the table, the girl leaning into her arm, watching the flames worry the wood down to embers. The scent of beans and onion and something richer filled the small room, and for the first time in days, she felt the ache in her stomach ease before a spoon touched it. When the stew was ready, he filled 3 bowls and set them down. The girl chattered between mouthfuls, telling stories half true and half dreamed, about the wind chime being the laugh of the moon, about a fox that lived under the porch and knew her name. The woman listened, her eyes catching on the way the man would look at the child, half-guarded, as though her joy was both a gift and a thing that could slip through his fingers if he wasn't careful. After the bowls were emptied and rinsed, the girl curled under the quilt in the rocking chair, the carved horse tucked under her chin. The woman watched her drift toward sleep, the lashes settling like shadows on her cheeks. She thought of the letter still in her coat pocket, its seal unbroken, and felt the weight of choice pressing at her. If she read it, the words might undo the fragile warmth here. If she didn't, she would be forever wondering what it said. He sat across from her now, elbows on his knees, hands loose but ready. She told him about the trains she'd taken, the stations where no one had called her name, the nights in rented rooms where the wallpaper seemed to lean away from her. Her voice was steady until she said, "I feel like a package no one claimed," and then the steadiness wavered. He didn't look away. "I know that feeling," he said, and the quiet after was not empty. It was the shape of understanding. Outside, the wind slammed the cabin with a force that rattled the tin chimney. The girl stirred but did not wake. The woman rose and went to the window, wiping a clear patch with her palm. Beyond the glass was a white wall, shifting and alive. She turned back to see him watching her, his face lit by the fire's long reach. Something unspoken passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but an opening. He rose and joined her at the window. "Storm'll last the night," he said. She nodded, and for a moment they stood so close she could hear the sound of his breath above the wind. It was steady, like the ticking of a clock that didn't mind waiting. When she moved to tend the fire, the girl whimpered in her sleep, the carved horse slipping from her grasp. The woman stooped to pick it up, then sat on the floor beside the chair, gathering the child against her. The little body relaxed instantly, a sigh warming the hollow of her neck. She smoothed the hair back from the girl's forehead, the motion unthinking but certain. He stood over them for a moment, the storm battering the walls as if to remind them what waited outside. His gaze moved from the child to her, pausing as though he had found something he had not been looking for. She met his eyes and held them. The wind chime clicked once in the draft, a bright note in the dark. In the firelight, the unfinished carving sat on the table beside the first horse, its ear still rough, its stance unsteady. She looked at it and felt the strange, dangerous thought that maybe it was meant for her. That maybe some things were not finished until they found the right hands. The wind roared again, but inside, the air seemed to settle. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough that she could feel the warmth from his coat. The girl's breathing deepened. The woman kept her hand on the child's back, her eyes on the flames, but the letter in her pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if it, too, had been listening. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world clean and strange. Snow lay high against the cabin walls, glittering under a sky so sharp it seemed the air might break if you breathed too hard. He hitched the wagon while she helped the girl into her coat, her pocket heavy with the letter she still hadn't opened. The road into town was muffled and bright, the only sounds the slow crunch of wheels and the soft hiss of the runners where they caught ice. People were already outside, shoveling steps, clearing troughs, stamping their boots to life. As the wagon rolled down Main Street, faces turned, some curious, some cautious. She felt each glance like a touch she hadn't asked for. He didn't look at anyone, but his presence beside her was an anchor in the moving air. The girl sat between them, swinging her legs, holding the carved horse as if it were the one thing that could not be taken. At the post office, The postmaster's spectacles flashed when he saw her. He rifled through the stack, pulling out a single envelope, its seal unbroken, the writing she knew by heart. The words inside had been waiting for days, maybe weeks, yet her pulse beat like she'd been caught in some act. She tucked it into her coat without looking. The postmaster's eyes lingered, but the man's hand on her back moved her gently toward the door. They made their way to the mercantile. While she and the girl waited by the bolts of fabric, voices murmured near the stove, about strangers, about winter, about the way some women came looking for husbands and left with less than they'd brought. She pretended not to hear, but the girl scowled openly, her small shoulders bristling. When they left, the gossip followed them out like a draft. At the square, the letter burned in her pocket. She pulled it free and broke the seal. The words were short, plain, final. He had found another. No apology, only the courtesy of telling her she need not wait. She stood still until the paper softened in her grip, then folded it twice and put it away. Her eyes lifted to find his on her, steady and unflinching. Without a word, he held out his hand. She took it, the gesture quiet but certain. Someone across the street stopped to watch. Others did too. He didn't let go. The girl, seeing their joined hands, slipped hers into the woman's other palm as though to make the picture complete. They walked on like that, past every pair of watching eyes, until the street curved toward the feed store and the last of the murmurs fell away. Back at the cabin, the fire was low but warm. He set bread and cheese on the table, then, after a moment's thought, a pot of spaghetti from the night before. The smell was humble but rich, the sauce clinging to the wooden spoon in slow ribbons. The girl fetched 3 plates without being told. They ate in a comfortable quiet, the kind where no one counts the minutes. When the plates were cleared, the girl disappeared into the corner and returned with the second carving, now finished, the ear smoothed, the stance sure. She set it beside the first on the table. "Yours," she said to the woman, her voice light but her eyes full. The woman reached into her shawl pocket and drew out the mitten she had kept since the night they met. She slipped it over the girl's hand, and it matched the other perfectly. The girl's smile was as wide as the winter sky. He watched this exchange from his chair, one arm resting on the table. Something in his expression softened, the way snow softens a hard edge. For the first time, she felt the pull of a future she hadn't dared name, one built not from promises made in letters, but from bread shared in a storm, from coats offered without condition, from a child's trust earned inch by inch. The girl climbed into her lap with the carved horse, and the man looked at them as if measuring a room he'd thought would always be empty. She met his gaze and found no pity there, only a kind of recognition that asked nothing and offered everything it had. Outside, the wind chimes spoke in small, bright notes, the sound threading into the quiet like a stitch. The firelight reached across the table, touching the 2 carved horses, the plates still warm from supper, the bread waiting to be cut again in the morning. It wasn't a mansion, or a wedding, or a promise made loud. It was spaghetti on a wooden table, and the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. And maybe that's how homes are made, one small kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.